Thanks for listening to the Open Discourse podcast. In this series, ODC co-founder and CEO Charles Mitchell sits down for a candid conversation with thought leaders, elected officials, entrepreneurs, and more. Today, he is joined by ODC's board chair, Susan Crawford, who is a senior federal judge and the former chair of the Bucknell Board of Trustees.
Susan Crawford, welcome to the Open Discourse podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You are our first Zoom guest, and I have to say your Zoom savvy is very impressive. And in a minute, I want to ask you about what that is behind you. I think that will be of great interest to our listeners. But first, what are the names of your dogs? Dogs, pets are a window into one's soul. And I think that having met your dogs, it will be a window both into your soul and your career for our listeners to know about those fine fellows that you live with.
Well, as you know, Charles, they're members of our family.
Exactly.
Currently, we have two Labrador retrievers. My husband and I have raised labs for a number of years, and several of them have been therapy dogs. I've even shown some of them on occasion. But right now, we have a yellow lab named Ronnie, a black lab named Dutch, and we used to have a yellow lab named Gipper. And there's a theme to all those names, as you well know. They're all named for President Reagan, for whom I used to work, and who is clearly one of my heroes.
Why is he one of your heroes, Susan?
Well, I think because of his leadership qualities and his great civility. I think he came in at a time when our nation needed that leadership. We needed a rebirth of our American spirit, and he brought that to us. He appealed to what was the best of all of us, and while he disagreed with his those on the other side of the aisle, he never denigrated them personally. He challenged their ideas with better ideas and brought great civility to Washington at a time when we had a national hangover from the Vietnam era. And I think he restored certainly confidence in our military, built up our national defense. I worked in the Defense Department, as you know, in the Pentagon, and it was a very exciting time to be there. So I count him among my many heroes.
Well, let's talk about how you got there a little bit. You're from Pittsburgh. You went to Bucknell, class of 1969. There's a place on display behind you that I know is pretty important to you. We'll get to that. But I mean, how does a young lady from Pittsburgh get from there to Bucknell to working in the Reagan administration, and then some other stuff since then that we'll talk about? How did that all happen?
Well, Charles, I wish I could tell you that I planned it, but I didn't. It happened.
I think that may be the most important part of your answer. I mean, a lot of young people, I think, need to hear that. You say it kind of in passing, and I understand why, but it's easy to put that pressure on yourself when you're an undergraduate at a place like Bucknell, that you have to have it all figured out, that the only way you're going to have a significant job is to have this master plan. I think it's beautiful that you didn't.
Well, I did not. And I've also told young people, sometimes you plan for opportunities, but other times they come along and they're unexpected. And you have to be willing to evaluate and take a risk sometimes. And that's clearly what I did in joining the Reagan administration. But long before that, when I graduated from Bucknell as a history major, I taught history for several years at Radnor High School in the Philadelphia area. And I coached the women's JV field hockey, basketball, and lacrosse teams. I enjoyed doing that very much, but I'd always wanted to go to law school. So after several years of doing that, I went to law school in Boston, ended up practicing back in Western Maryland. That wasn't by design. I had thought about staying in New England, but we had a family friend who was a local attorney, later became a judge, and he invited me back to clerk in his office my first year after law school. And I loved it so much that I came back. He was already on the bench by that time that I graduated, but I came back and joined his old law firm with two partners and was practicing law in Garrett County, got married to Roger, had a wonderful life here, ran for a local elected position. I was elected to the Republican State Central Committee in Garrett County, Maryland, later subsequently elected as chair of that committee. So I got around to statewide conventions and meetings. Now, as you know, the state of Maryland, it's a pretty blue state. So, but we were one or two red counties in the state, and obviously I came to somebody's notice. But our big job in the 1980 election was to get the vote out. The plan was to have a large turnout in Western Maryland, which tends to be conservative, and the Eastern Shore, and hopefully offset losses and Baltimore and around Washington. Well, we came close, but not close enough in 1980. 1984, President Reagan did carry Maryland. But in 1980, we had a 75% turnout, almost 70. I think it was 74.9 to be exact, in our county. So we thought we had done our job. And got an invitation to the inauguration, and I like to laugh and tell the story that Roger rented a tuxedo. He later owned 5 tuxedos because he had to use them so much. We went down to several days of, the festivities, inaugural ball, and I'll never forget sitting on the lawn that day in front of the Capitol. It was January day, probably in the mid-50s, and just about noon when President Reagan was ready to take the oath of office, the sun came out. And of course, the hostages were released, the Iranian hostages. It was just a very celebratory time. And then after that was all over, we went back home to Western Maryland, back to my law practice. Roger was doing government contracts work for a defense contractor in nearby Cumberland, and thinking of starting a family. One Friday afternoon in February, about a month later, I was sitting in my law office. I have to admit, I wasn't paying close attention to what I was doing. I was watching the snow coming down and thinking of meeting Roger later that evening and going night skiing at the Wisp. And I got this phone call from an attorney I had met through Maryland politics. And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "Susie, how would you like to come to Washington and work for the president?" And after I picked myself up off the floor, I said, "Well, Tom, if I'm going to make a big change like that, I want to do something that's of real interest to me in national security or national defense." Well, shortly thereafter, I was interviewing with the Secretary of the Army for a position as then Deputy General Counsel for the Army. Joined the Reagan administration and the Defense Department that September, and 2 years later became the General Counsel of the Army. I found out later something very interesting, though. This attorney friend, was actually working with a woman named Marcia Carlucci. Now, that may sound familiar to you. Caspar Weinberger was the Secretary of Defense, and his deputy was a fellow named Frank Carlucci. Wonderful, wonderful man. And Marcia was Frank's wife. And Marcia was actively looking for a couple of women to put into deputy positions, so that on the theory that the lifespan of a political appointee, a principal, is 2 years, and that principal would move on. And if the deputy had done a good job, she could move up and become the principal. And that happened with me, and that happened with another woman in the Defense Department. So I didn't know that was going on at the time. I never expected to get that phone call, but I'm glad I said yes. I would go for it, and moved to DC. And at that point, I hadn't read the book Future Shock. You may remember that book, and it talks about stresses in your life, and some of the big stressors are starting a new job, moving, and starting a family. Well, I did all 3 at the same time without. I'm glad I hadn't read the book because I wasn't stressed about it. But moved to DC. I think I was 5 months pregnant, and moved in with family friends for the first couple of weeks until we could find a place to rent. And then we later bought a home there and ended up spending 30 years in the DC area and raising our daughter there.
And how did your husband, I'm sorry, go ahead, Susan.
I said, I never planned all of that, but it happened. And when the opportunity came along, we jumped for it and took advantage of it. I'm glad we did.
Yeah, it sounds like you didn't hesitate at all. Am I hearing the history right? I mean, when you got that phone call, you said, "Yes, I'm very interested."
Well, I wasn't sure that anything would come of it, but I said, "Yes, I'll do it if it's something vital and of interest to me." My 2 law partners, "Oh, poo-poo, they're just playing with you. They don't mean it." But they didn't want me to leave.
Now, given that you had all 3 of those big changes happening at once, the job part we've kind of covered. How did you and your husband, Roger, make that work? Obviously, you had a baby on the way. Also, he had his own job in Western Maryland. Right. So how did you make it all work?
Well, he left that job ultimately and got another job in DC, but he had to look for one. It didn't take long. But he had to be part of the equation too. It wasn't just me. It involved both of us. And it worked.
Yeah.
It worked. Yeah. I mean,
now you mentioned it was 30 years. Although there are times when a president has been in office for multiple decades. President Reagan wasn't one of them. 25th Amendment was in place. So you clearly didn't serve in the Reagan administration for 30 years. You became general counsel in the Army, but then what? There was a further future for you in D.C.
Yes. Well, then when President Bush was elected in 1988, I was asked to stay on, but in a different position. And President Bush nominated me for a position called the Inspector General of the Department of Defense.
Something much in the news in recent years.
Yeah, there have been a lot of IGs in the news, and it's an important function. It's an interesting kind of job, though. It's one of those thankless jobs where, by law, you report to the secretary. I reported to then Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense. I was on his staff. But you're also, by law, supposed to keep Congress fully and currently informed. So Congress thinks you're a tool of the management, and management thinks you're a snitch to Congress. It's like straddling a barbed wire fence sometimes, but it works. I think the key is, Congress can ask you to look at things, investigate different items, and you treat Congress very fairly and timely, as well as the department. The IG conducts inspections, investigations, and audits. And our job was to audit many of the defense programs that were underway, both financial audit and programmatic audits, to make sure that they were spending the taxpayers' money wisely. And we had a federal law enforcement agency called the Defense Criminal Investigative Service that works for the IG, and their main job was to root out contract fraud. So it's a full plate. I did that for 2 years, and President Bush then nominated me to the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces for a 15-year term. And that was my thank you for doing the IG's work for 2 years, I think. And I moved on to the court in 1991 and spent 15 years there. Unlike other courts, that court has a term of years. And then after those term of years, you retire as an active judge, you become a senior judge. And I am now a senior judge of that court, and on occasion have gone back and sat on cases, and still keep in touch with the court very closely. It was a wonderful time in my life.
A lot of people in Washington have the aspiration to make their first name judge. At what point in your life did it come onto your radar that you might become Judge Crawford, and how did that idea strike you?
Well, this is another one of those phone calls that I got that was a little unexpected. I had thought about it when I was the IG. In fact, I had just become the IG, and I got a call from the then head of the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice, a fellow by the name of Bill Barr, later to become Attorney General twice. And I knew Bill from Maryland politics, a great guy, bright individual. In fact, he almost became my deputy general counsel, but it didn't quite work out. Somebody else came in, but he was a candidate to be a deputy. Well, that was another one of those conversations when Bill said to me, "Had you ever thought about being a federal judge?" And I said, "Bill, only my husband knows how much I've thought about it." He said, "Well, we have an opening in the Fourth Circuit for a Maryland judge, and I have to tell you, it's pretty well wrapped up. But I just want to put your name in so it circulates, so people start thinking about you that way. Would you be willing to have me do that?" I said, "Well, sure. Never know what's going to come of it." And but I thought, and so after I got off the phone, I thought, maybe I better let Secretary Cheney know. I just got this IG's job. I'm not really out hunting for another one. So I did. And his reaction was, "Well, that would be wonderful. I'll support you. But while you're thinking about it, we have this specialized court that handles all the criminal appeals in the Defense Department. And you would be ideal for that with your background." So appellate court is all civilian, the court that you visited last week. And so I said, "Well, gee, if this doesn't work out, maybe I will throw my hat in the ring for that." And of course, I had the full backing of the Defense Department going for that position. And it wasn't really an issue with the White House. I was nominated for it. And in 1991, moved to the court.
Now, you've mentioned a number of times the partisan complexion of Washington and your background doing some local political work. At that time, if my memory is correct, the United States Senate was controlled by the Democratic Party. You
That's
obviously
correct.
were appointed by a Republican and had a Republican CV. What was the confirmation process like for you in 1991?
Well, I went through two, for the IG's position
Mm.
as well as for the clerk, and both were unanimous votes, and not contentious hearings at all. In
So what's
fact,
it
when
like for you
I
to watch the stuff today?
oh, it's a different world. When I was introduced to, you have your home state representatives or whatever introduce you to the Senate, and both confirmation hearings. I had bipartisan support. I had Beverly Byron, who was our Democratic congresswoman, did a great job for us. My family, even though my family was Republican, we always supported the Byrons when they represented us. And I had a Republican representative from Maryland as well. So I had bipartisan introductions.
Well, let's dwell.
Washington was different then, Charles. Washington was very different then. I think people reached across the aisle. There was much more civility, and they worked together. For most of President Reagan's first and second term, the Senate was controlled by the Democrats. And of course, the House was the whole time. I think he had the Senate maybe the first 2 years. But there was a large group of individuals who would reach across the aisle for what was best for the country. And President Reagan was that way, too. Even though he had some strong principles that he agreed with, he'd say that if he could get 80% of what he wanted in dealing with Congress, that was a win. It wasn't this all or nothing today, my way or the highway. Democrats weren't like that, and Republicans weren't like that then. They really did come together for the best interests of the country.
Yeah, no, you've stated that loud and clear, Susan. So let's stay on that, because I suspect it has something to do with your present activities. What do you think has changed, maybe in Washington, maybe more broadly in society, that we don't have that kind of civility today? In fact, we have the opposite. We have not only incivility, we have political violence.
Right.
What's driving all that from your perspective?
Well, I wish I knew, because if I had a better insight on it, I might be able to turn it off. But there's a lack of humanity today. I don't think we see people as people and reach out to discuss ideas with them and debate ideas with them, even though we may agree or disagree with them. I think human life has been cheapened. I'm not sure what the cause of it all is. You could say social media. It's easy to sit behind a keyboard and attack somebody and not see them face to face. But I'm sure that plays a role in it. But our leaders just don't seem to be able to. This current shutdown, for example, what in the world is it over? A clean CR. For how many times do we pass clean CRs just to get more time to debate issues? That's what it's asking for. I just don't understand. Now people are losing not only paychecks but food subsistence, and it's the military is not being paid. Our skies are endangered because of the air traffic controllers, and for what? Why don't we sit down and talk out our differences, and buy a little bit more time to do that? That's all the CR is asking for. But that's an example of how we just aren't pulling together. The last time we really pulled together as a nation, it took a real tragedy like 9/11. For a time afterwards, I think we were in lockstep together for what's best for the United States. And then it fell apart again. I'm not sure why politics has become so corrosive. I have no desire to go back to Washington. I'll go back and visit my court from time to time, but my goodness, it's just a very different place from when I used to work there.
I think we'll have more to say about people coming together and debating the issues, Susan. But before we go there, you brought up 9/11. You had another really interesting job after 9/11. For people like me, I think it's front and center. I was at Bucknell on 9/11. today's students, it's amazing to me to be reminded. Many, unless they're non-traditionally aged students, they weren't alive on 9/11, so it has no immediate emotional purchase with them. But they've read about it in history books. We all understand it was a tragic and pivotal day in our nation's history. You actually were one of the leading people in terms of how our country responded to that, particularly as it relates to Guantanamo. So can you tell that part of your story, how you got involved in that and what that was like?
Well, after I had my term had ended at the court, I had started on my way back to my special place in Western Maryland, and the Defense Department called me once again to step back into service and to oversee the Guantanamo trials. Specifically, the general counsel of the Defense Department called, a young fellow I knew well. I had hired him years ago out of law school, and they had this position called convening authority for the military commissions, and there had been an Army general whom I knew had been doing it for 3 years. It was a 3-year deal, and they wanted me to step in and do it. And actually, it was not a bad time because the Supreme Court had ruled earlier that year that military commission, the outline for military commissions, the procedures, they had to be approved by Congress. And up until that point, the executive branch had been doing that. So Congress stepped in and passed the Military Commissions Act, which was, I think, a big step forward. So I was asked to come in right after that. And the Military Commissions Act gave a lot of due process rights to the detainees under what's called the law of war, the law of armed conflict. And so it set about trying to set up trials and try some of the detainees for war crimes. They had to be war crimes, not general crimes. They had to be specific war crimes. And we got the trials up and running, had a few of them tried. I've been somewhat chagrined by how long this has taken. I mean, they're still going on today. We still have some detainees there. Not all of them could be tried. I mean, we had at one point, I think there were over 800 there, but there were probably a good 40 or 50 that could stand trial for war crimes, and got the trial started. And I don't know how many are still going on today. Of course, the 9/11, the 3 now, 9/11 individuals, 3 or 4, are the Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the others are still in the news today by trying to do a plea bargain that's been overturned. And where that stands, I'm not sure today. I had referred charges against 5 of them and referred them as capital charges. And then administrations changed, and the new administration, the Obama administration, wanted to try them in the federal courts. And so I dismissed without prejudice the charges against them, which meant that they could be brought back again. And there was an effort to try them in the federal courts. And as you know, that fell apart politically. And by that time, I had left it to my successor to come in and recharge them again. But that was an interesting time. I made a couple of trips to Guantanamo just to view the facilities and view where we were holding them, and in part to make sure that everything was being done properly. But I also wanted to see it all for myself. I didn't try the cases. I wasn't the trial judge. We had military judges trying them and appellate courts to oversee them. My job was to make a determination if there was enough evidence to charge them and to hold them over for trial. And so I would review what the government sent me. I also had a responsibility to be sure that both the defense attorneys and the government attorneys had the resources that they needed. And you can only imagine the logistics involved, but trying to try these cases with a lot of classified information on an island in the Caribbean, and how to transport not only people, but how to get evidence down there. We had a state-of-the-art courtroom built, and we had to be able to send electronically tons of documentary evidence, including highly classified evidence, and keep it secure. So there was a lot of logistics involved in setting all of this up.
Unbelievable. Wow. I do want to get a little bit more into your court, Susan, but first, we've made all these references to Western Maryland. We really have to play that out. So you've talked about your happy place. You've clearly got a sailing vessel behind you. Can you share a little bit more about that happy place of yours, your habit of sailing, and also how did you migrate from Western Pennsylvania to Western Maryland?
Well, as you know, I'm from Pittsburgh, South Hills of Pittsburgh. And in 1954, my grandparents bought a summer house on Deep Creek Lake in Western Maryland, which is about 100 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. And ever since then, I have been here, at least in the summertime, now live here full time. I grew up on the lake in the summertime, and my family bought a sailboat for my sister and I. The sailboat behind me is called a Flying Scot. It's manufactured here in Garrett County, Maryland, a little town called Deer Park. And there are probably some 6,000 of them around the world today. Number 7 that you see is indeed the 7th one ever made, the oldest one sailing on the lake. I'm not the original owner, but Roger and I bought it for ourselves as a wedding present in 1979. It was available through the Flying Scot Boat Company, and we've been sailing it off and on ever since. And I'm happy to say one of my grandsons has really become quite a good little sailor racing it. And racing with another individual on her boat. She's a great teacher. And so number 7 is back at the boat company this winter, getting an overhaul and new rigging. So be ready for him to race this summer. Flying Scot is a great boat. It's a for people who sail, it's a 19-foot centerboard sloop. It's a family boat, can also be a racing boat. I raced for years. I just do day sailing today. And it was designed and built by a little Scotsman named Gordon Douglas. We called him Sandy Douglas. Sandy's no longer with us. He died many years ago, but he was a great small boat sailor. And he taught me to sail years ago when my parents had another boat, and my sister and I were learning to sail and race. Sandy spent a lot of time with us in the boat because he was excited the young kids were actually sailing it. Up until that point, the only people racing on our lake were men, fathers, with the kids maybe crewing, but we were the first teenagers and let alone the first young women to race in the weekend races. So Sandy took a great interest in us and helped us along.
You've had a lot of firsts in your life, Susan. I mean, you just mentioned first female, racers on the lake. As you mentioned, I had the privilege of taking a group of Bucknell students to your court about a week ago. It was noted then you were the first female chief judge of the Court of Appeals for the military circuit. When I talk to people who are firsts, I find they sometimes really it's a point of pride, that I was the first this or the first that. Other people tend to say, no, I am who I am. That's not something I'm focused on. How do you think about that? From your perspective, is it an important part of your life that in so many of the areas where you've trod, be it on the lake or in Washington, D.C., that you were the first?
I don't know that being the first is that big a deal for me, but I think just having had the opportunity to do it is more important than being the first. I sometimes forget that I was the first woman on the court. There have been several since. I don't know why I was the first. I don't know why there wasn't one before me, but I'm hoping that's not why I was picked. I want to be picked for my abilities, not my gender.
Well, I can give some testimony on that. And I have not had the chance to tell you this, and I thought on camera would be a funny place to do it. At your court last week, discussion came up. Judges are often asked who their judicial influences are. I mean, we've all seen that at the Supreme Court level on those very contentious confirmations that we now have. I had the opportunity to ask couple of people who are on your court these days that question, and I had no idea what they're going to say. I don't know these individuals. Wouldn't have been surprised if somebody said, John Marshall or Antonin Scalia, right? Or, some of those names from the history books. And you can probably guess the answer that came back. The answer that came back was the jurist I most admire is Susan Crawford. So that says something about your abilities, I would say. There were a lot of smiles in that courtroom when that one came out. Let's talk about that a little bit if we could. First of all, you said just now how important it is to you that you had certain opportunities. It seems to me at this point in your life, also part of what you're doing is making sure other people have those opportunities. You gave a bunch of students from our alma mater the opportunity to meet an appellate judge. It's kind of a big deal, even to sit in the seats at your court. But just more broadly, as the board chair of the Open Discourse Coalition, you're making incredible opportunities available to today's college students, first at our alma mater, Bucknell, and now more broadly. In fact, you personally spoke at one of our first events outside of Bucknell at Villanova Law School in the, around the corner from where you used to teach high school. So all that, to me, Susan, it begs the question, why is that mission, why is the mission of Open Discourse Coalition so important to you at this point in your life?
Because I guess I have to back up to when I was an undergraduate at Bucknell. I treasure the education that I received at Bucknell. I was a history major. And my favorite professor, who's also the head of the history department and my advisor, was Dr. Richard Drinnen. And Dr. Drinnen was the campus radical of our time, because I was a Vietnam era. I remember when I was a junior, we had a big convocation weekend in the spring, and Vice President Hubert Humphrey was invited to speak and came to campus. My parents were there. We were sitting in Davis Gym to hear the vice president, and President Charles Watts of the university stood up to introduce him. And from the floor, amidst the faculty, Dr. Drinnen stood up at the introduction and said, "You are a disgrace, and this is a disgrace." And he led a walkout of about 30 faculty and students. Now, that was pretty dramatic for Bucknell. Dr. Drinnen did not interrupt their vice president. He did not call him a name, other than called the whole event a disgrace. But it was a Vietnam protest. It was peaceful. It was disruptive, yes, but he let the vice president give his speech, and he walked out. Now, Dr. Drinnen and I were worlds apart politically. I had him for many classes, and I never felt that I couldn't speak my mind in his class. I never felt inhibited from saying what I thought. I never felt that my grade would be in jeopardy if I said or wrote in an essay what I thought. I learned from Dr. Drinnen some great skills of critical thinking, of challenging, debating, trying to defeat your opponent with better ideas. And I remember my senior history seminar was on the Warren Commission report. It's a few years after President Kennedy had been assassinated. And we all picked, there were maybe 7 or 8 of us in the seminar, we picked different aspects of the Warren Commission report and we challenged it. And then we had to present that to the seminar. Well, I dwelt on the forensics of that magic bullet and whether that same bullet could have injured both President Kennedy and Governor Conley, as the Warren Commission had concluded. And I think I had raised some questions about that. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but the whole point of that was to, question your government. Look at what they're trying to tell you and go behind it. And that critical thinking that I learned not only from Dr. Drinnen, but from others, was absolutely essential to my education. I think freedom of expression, I would say, is the essence of a liberal arts education. I think when Jordan Peterson visited our campus a few years ago, when the Open Discourse Coalition sponsored him, Dr. Peterson would say freedom of expression is a liberal arts education. We shouldn't try to shield people from ideas that they don't like or that they feel uncomfortable around. And what we should be doing is not restricting expression, but opening it up and debating these issues on campus, so that our students can learn their own skills of critical thinking. If we shield them from ideas that they feel uncomfortable around, we're not doing them a service at all. That's a great disservice. And I'm afraid there's just a little bit too much of that in higher education today. I like very much what we're doing at the Open Discourse Coalition. We're bringing in, as you know, Charles, speakers from all over. I mean, these are not just conservative speakers. All kinds of speakers are coming in and debating ideas with our students. Our Culture and the Constitution program, we brought in people on both sides of the debate over abortion and over gun control. And I think some of our students left those programs saying, I've never heard both sides of the issue, and they disagreed so agreeably. Civil discourse is so important. So yes, I'm passionate about it, but I think it goes back to the experience that I had as an undergraduate student at Bucknell, how much I learned from it. And I want to be sure that we're providing the same for our students today.
That's beautiful. I knew that we were both history majors. I'd never heard about your advisor before. I think
he was wonderful. I learned a great deal from him.
Well, and so here's something you and I have in common that we didn't know till today. Your anti-war history advisor, by teaching you critical thinking, trained up a top Department of Defense official on the other side of the fence politically from himself. And, I think knowing what I do of your court and also your role as the convening authority in Guantanamo, you got into some of the most serious issues that resulted in time of war and time of peace just in the armed forces. Who could have predicted that an anti-war professor would train up such person? For me, my history advisor, I'm delighted to be able to speak her name into posterity, Leslie Patrick. She was the chair of the history department when I was an undergraduate.
I knew her. Yeah.
And you probably know that Professor Patrick's views were pretty similar to your advisor's views.
That's right.
But I would offer the same testimony that Professor Patrick never told me what to think. She taught me how to think. She taught me how to articulate. She taught me to write. She taught me to think. And what I did with those skills was to ultimately have a career in part in Washington, like yourself, but also in part in my state capital, espousing policy principles with which she would vigorously disagree. One of her gifts to me when I was an undergraduate was the Marx Engels reader. But she didn't say, you have to believe this. She said, you should read this. And I agree with it, and maybe you will too. I went the opposite direction. I'm more of a Milton Friedman guy. But I didn't know that we had that in common in terms of our advisors as history majors at Bucknell. That's really neat. So you've talked about why you got involved. You're one of the most involved people. You chaired the board of Bucknell. Now you chair the board of the ODC. You also were the first, you and your husband Roger, to make a long-term giving commitment to ensure that ODC doesn't just bring in these great people today, but that it operates and flourishes long into the future. So when you think about the future of ODC, how that fits into what we were talking about earlier in terms of the overall situation in our country, what would you say are your hopes for the future?
Well, I would hope that by touching Bucknell students, we're making them better citizens to go out and practice civility and practice the critical thinking and the free expression that seems to be lacking today. I don't know how many will go into politics, but wherever they go, I hope we're exposing them to that in some small way. You can only do so much and affect a certain sphere of influence. But I do think the idea of the Open Discourse Coalition is growing beyond Bucknell, as you're well aware, Charles, and we're helping that grow beyond Bucknell. I think there's a need across higher education for it, not just at Bucknell. But by serving as a good example at Bucknell, I think we can expand elsewhere. I know that we already have done so in some areas in Pennsylvania, and we're also perhaps at the University of Virginia. So the more it expands, I think the more we can try to defeat this tribalism that we have in our society today.
Amen. I love that. Susan, when I think about what you said about your advisor, and I also think about your predecessor, Bill Groover, the last interview we did on this podcast, it makes me think about advice in the course of one's life. You've gotten some good and bad advice in your life. Bill talked a lot about some of what he'd heard in his life. Is there an example you think of in terms of your life thus far, either on the good side or the bad side, some really noteworthy advice, life-changingly good or really bad, and I'm glad I didn't take it, or I'm sorry that I did? Is there an example that comes to mind in terms of best or worst advice in your life?
Well, I had a good friend when I was then Deputy General Counsel of the Army. And he was a retired Army Colonel. John Shannon was his name, African-American, great guy. He was doing some special jobs for the Secretary of the Army. And I was under consideration for an EEO position on Secretary Weinberger's staff. I forget what it was exactly called. And John came into my office one day and he said, "What are you thinking? You have a man's job. Why do you want a woman's job?" Just like that. I said, "Well, I hadn't thought of it like that, John." He said, "You stay where you are and better things are going to happen." And so I turned down that other job and ended up then within a few months as General Counsel of the Army. If I had gone on to that EEO job, I don't know. It was a spokesperson for a lot of good programs in the Defense Department, but it would have taken me out of the legal path and probably, the rest of the path that I had had. So that was excellent advice. John is no longer with us, but he was a dear friend, and we used to get together every year on Valentine's Day. He'd take me out to lunch. Wow,
Susan, that is great advice. You probably never would have been Judge Crawford if not for that guy, John. That's a great example. Thank you for sharing it. Now, as you know, having watched other episodes of this podcast, there are two other questions that I ask every guest. I love them because no two answers are the same, and you learn something about the person when you ask. So I'm going to end our time together with those two questions that you've seen from others. What is a great book that you recommend to our listeners?
One of my favorite books is The Boys in the Boat. It is the story, if you've read it, there's also a movie. It is the story set in the Depression in the United States of 9 young men from the Pacific Northwest who were at the University of Washington on their crew team and how they won the 1936 Olympic gold. But in doing so, they overcame, it's just such an all-American story. I think that's why I love it. These kids came from mostly poor backgrounds. They all had their own individual struggles. They persevered both in college and with crew. They had to learn to become a team. If you know anything about crew, you work as a unit. It's not an individual sport at all. And, the contrast between, the American unity and Nazi Germany at the time, it was Hitler's Germany in 1936. And these 9 working class young men went over to the Olympics and the Olympic officials tried to sabotage them and gave them the worst lane of all. And they had a horrible start and they came from behind. And you can see the actual race. You can find it on YouTube. But I just love the story of what these young men did and how they overcame so many struggles and they persevered. As I said, it's a real all-American story. You find yourself rooting for them along the way, and it tells you learn a lot about crewing also. A little bit like Seabiscuit, you learn a lot about the jockeys and the horrible things some of them had to go through. But this story of teamwork and pulling together and their Olympic journey and underdogs, who came out on top with Olympic gold. It's just a wonderful, wonderful, true story.
Love that, especially since I'm married to a former Bucknell crew team member. I find that to be an excellent answer.
That I did not know, Charles.
Again, it's part of why I love having these conversations, is both sides learn something that they never knew before. We spent a lot of time together, given our respective roles at the ODC. You didn't know that about Carissa, and
I did not know that about Carissa. I do know that our now late trustee and good friend, just lost his name, but anyway, he contributed a lot. Bill Graham from Philadelphia, contributed a great deal to help the women's crew team as well as field hockey. You may recall years ago, and I wasn't chair, but I was on the board then, we downgraded our men's wrestling program to a club sport, in part to come into compliance with Title IX. And one of the unfortunate aspects of Title IX was that it hurt some of the men's sports while trying to build up the women's sports, to try to get that parity and that equity that was required by law. And we didn't do away with wrestling, but we downgraded it. And a lot of the wrestling community alumni were very upset with us, Bill Graham being one of them. And when we explained to Bill Graham, it was why we had to do that, we had to build up women's sports. He said, well, I'll help you with that, and gave us millions of dollars to do that. And when we brought wrestling back as a varsity sport, and it's stronger than ever, just through the good graces of Bill Graham. But one of the women's sports that he really helped was the crew team.
That's such a great story. I must confess, I knew parts of that story. I was a student when that controversy broke. I'm also from Philadelphia, as you know, and have driven by the Graham Building in Center City many times. And every time I drove by, I thought about that generosity, because I remember when it was announced. But I confess, being an undergraduate at the time, and also not being together with Carissa at the time, I missed the detail that was the women's sport in which Bill had invested all those resources. That's amazing how stories come together even in ways that you didn't anticipate.
And women's field hockey too. And I had played field hockey at Bucknell. And the field that the women play on, Graham Field, is named for him. I remember driving to Philadelphia. I think I was then chair when we finally got this all straightened out, and receiving the check from him. Of course, it was a symbolic big check, but to hold up, to help in sports. And Bill was just immensely generous to Bucknell sports, both men and women. And he got a kick out of going to the women's field hockey games and watching them play on their field too.
We stand on tremendous shoulders. Thank you for remembering him in our conversation. That's great. Okay, well, Susan, last question. You've known a lot of world historic figures. You've referenced 4 of them that I can remember thus far in our conversation: 2 presidents, 1 vice president, and a 2-time attorney general. So, that's pretty good lead in to you sharing who is your favorite world historical figure.
Well, of course, I'd say Ronald Reagan is my favorite, but there's someone else that often gets overlooked because his life was cut short. I think he would have been perhaps an early president, certainly one of our founding fathers. That's a fellow named Dr. Joseph Warren from Boston, who was a major general in the Revolutionary War. Now, I never knew much about him, even though I was a history major, but my daughter and her family moved from Fairfax County to Warren County, Virginia. And I got to thinking one day, well, I wonder who this Warren, who's the county named after? And knowing that it was Virginia, I really expected perhaps it's a Confederate general. But it was not. It was Major General Dr. Joseph Warren. And the more I learned about Joseph Warren, he was of course, a physician, had gone to Harvard Medical School. He was quite an orator and an American patriot. He was a member of the Sons of Liberty. And he was killed. He was a martyr, killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill. But prior to that, he had been a key leader in the pre-revolution movement. It was Dr. Warren who sent Paul Revere and William Dawes on their ride that night to warn that the British were coming. And it was Dr. Warren who wrote a great deal and talked a great deal about the need for liberty and to fight against the tyranny of King George and Great Britain. In those days, the generals were usually in the background, not on the battlefield with their men, but Dr. Warren was helping his men lead the charge and unfortunately was shot in the head with a musket ball at the Battle of Bunker Hill and didn't survive. But I've often wondered, had he survived, I'm sure he would have been part of the Declaration of Independence. I'm sure he would have been part of the writing of the Constitution, and he may well have been one of our early presidents. We would have had to rewrite the history books. So sort of a little known individual that had a great impact early on, particularly in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and in standing up for our freedoms and our liberties in the pre-revolutionary days.
What
a shout out to him.
Oh, yeah. What a perfect shout out, especially, this is almost 250 years to the day since his death. It's particularly interesting you bring that up, Susan, because I don't know if you've ever read, here's my book recommendation, The British Are Coming by Rick Atkinson. I haven't read it, but I know of it. Yeah, it's fairly new. And it is the textbook for a new ODC program this year. As you know, we have a student seminar, largely, although not exclusively, for ROTC cadets on the ideological, cultural, economic, and military origins of the Revolution. That Atkinson book is one of the resources that we've made available to the students. It's on my giveaway shelf in my office. I have some of our best program-related books that students can have if they're going to read them, of course, which many of our students do. Anyway, it's remarkable that you bring up General Warren because I just read about him in the Atkinson book.
Did you?
It's on my bedside table.
Well, good. I'll have to get the Atkinson book too and read it. And of course,
I think I know a place where you might be able to get that if you want to.
Good. Well, and of course, Warren also fought at the Battle of Lexington and Concord too.
Yes.
And he had tremendous leadership skills, and people followed him. And that's why I think he would have easily been one of our founding fathers, along with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and the rest. But he potentially could have been one of our early presidents as well.
Yes. It's one of the reasons I love asking that question is you always get an interesting and an educational answer. And I suspect for many of our listeners, that'll be the first time they've heard Joseph Warren's name. And I hope that embarks them upon some curiosity and some reading and some learning and some celebrating of the legacy of this country which you have served and which you are helping to preserve now through your service to ODC. So for that and so many other reasons, Susan, I'm honored to be your colleague in this effort, and I'm honored that you joined me today on the Open Discourse podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charles.